Hi, everyone, and welcome to Perfect Prey, a Coercive Control podcast. I'm glad you're here. My name is Dr. Christine Marie Cocchiola, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker and have a doctorate in clinical social welfare, where I researched coercive control and the impact on both adult and child victims. Most importantly, I am a survivor and a protective parent. Victims and survivors of coercive control are never to blame, but I chose the name Perfect Prey because coercive controller, narcissistic abusers are individuals who seem to have characterologically disordered personalities, and they do choose who to prey upon. They choose people who tend to be agreeable and conscientious, perhaps loyal to a fault, fixers, optimistic, and empathic. And these coercive controllers prey upon those who are most vulnerable, including our children. It's part of their plan to gain control. How do we help our children when they are experiencing systematic, unacknowledged child abuse? We need to understand how these coercive controllers, harmful individuals, predatory parents attempt to exert their power over us and our children. We need to look beyond a trauma-informed lens, but also layer it with a coercive control lens. So, let's engage in personal power conversations that will create the protective parts that will derail the coercive controller from their plan. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Perfect Prey. I'm so glad you're here. I am so honored to have a great academic who's been working in the field for a long time and really been so remarkable in publishing things related to oppression. And I'm just beyond words to have her here on the podcast to talk about some of her research as it relates to not only children being harmed in various ways, but certainly in the family court system, parental alienation, and to talk about the Hague Convention. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Sonja Ayeb-Karlsson.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll introduce myself briefly. My name is Professor Sonja Ayeb-Karlsson. I'm based at UCL, where I lead a research group called Everyday Disasters and Violences. I've done a lot of different things. And actually, it might be nice to even say what led me into this space. So as a little girl, I was a very wise little girl who spent a lot of time thinking, and I would see my parents and how they spent a lot of their time working. And I established quite early that I wanted to work with something that actually made a change in life and for human beings. So I decided early on that I wanted to work on human rights. And the first actual professional role that overlapped with this was with the United Nations, where I was placed out in Bangladesh to look at human beings' responses and rights and protections in the context of climate change and environmental shocks, so cyclones, floods, storms. And that was my first overlap, actually, with victim survivors, both children experiencing child sexual abuse in post-disaster context. But another really important element that I found, and which I then established into my doctorate, was that a lot of women decided not to evacuate in the context of floods or cyclones because of the fear of sexual assaults and violence. So I framed that already then around entrapment. And this was actually well before I started moving into the area and understanding that there was a separate body of research around entrapment with coercive control. So I really looked at entrapment in terms of first geographical, financial, political, social, but also emotional and psychological, and legal, but in the context of migrants and asylum seekers. And from there, then I moved into legal entrapment in the context of our legal systems, so family courts as well as criminal courts.
Yeah, that's quite remarkable because there is such a huge intersection, right? And because something happens behind closed doors, and we assume within a family system that has the appearance of being relatively stable, happy socioeconomically, maybe
in a place where we wouldn't have these alerts going off. And the reality is that it's very prevalent across all demographics, and it's happening behind closed doors. Yeah. So,
Yeah, I think for me it was also very much a shock because I really worked in country contexts where I thought that human rights was really violated. So Bangladesh, South Africa, the Philippines, a lot of countries in the global South, South America. And then, of course, with the PhD, I was based in the UK, and I really started to get my eyes open for all the human right violations that is happening all around us and in our societies, and particularly in the context of violence against women and children. And when I entered into the space of family court, it was really a shock. And I think maybe even more so in England and Wales, because I still struggle to grasp that there are these family court orders that prohibit the women and children, not so much, but the mothers particularly, to speak about their experiences and trauma and pain and really work through them. So that's inherent in the legal system, which I think if we use frameworks, we could argue that that in itself is a violation.
absolutely. You know that I'm the co-author of the book Framed, because these 22 stories that people, to your point, even those of us working in the fields, sometimes cannot wrap our minds around the fact that this is actually occurring. And that even when a story happens and we hear about it in the social media world, which is one of the really great benefits of social media, right? It's a place for people to share, is that even when that happens, it's really interesting how, I'm sure you experience this working in other countries. An atrocity happens, a major disaster happens, and very quickly, the human nature is to kind of forget about how imperative it is to respond to that, or to be engaged in creating safety measures around it. And that's what we see, of course, happening in family court. If we could compile all the stories, this is why a couple of Aprils ago I said I want to get some of these stories in a book, because the compilation and to create a really significant switch or pivot that this is a problem. How do we do that? I don't know what the answer is, right?
I think what you are doing is such a great thing because we have all these victim survivors who don't have a voice. And then there are people who are in a position where they can actually, give them back their voice or, raise their voices for them. And it's also a method that I used in my previous work because a lot of people didn't understand climate change, the actual impact that it would have on human beings. So I started very early using storytelling methods, thinking about how we tell or told stories, back in the days, and the meaning that storytelling has in terms of passing on wisdom or really emphasizing values and what's important to us and what we want to be and what we would like to avoid to become. So I think that is probably the most powerful thing that we have, and do that in a way that we can. So I mean the small thing that I've done both in my legal article where I analyze case law, but also in other work, is to really maintain the voices of victim survivors. So whether there is just pulling out a sentence that has been reinstated by a judge from a court order, or if it's an interview that you have been able to do in a way so that you protect victim survivors' identity. And I'm recording a lot of these experiences and putting them up on social media. I think that just kind of gives them back the power that they've been ripped off through the legal system.
Yeah, I think we talked about it briefly, right? This idea that, victims' voices do need to be heard, and not every victim has the ability to share their story or takes the risk, because there's a lot of risk in all of this. And you work with the Hague Convention, and I don't think all of our listeners probably know what that means. And I was listening to you someplace else, and you do such a great job of trying to explain it in a way that it is a further entrapment, right? And so can you explain for our listeners what that is?
Yeah, I'll try to do it in a very basic and lay people way. So, of course, we have the family court system that decides in terms of the child's best interest within countries. But I think what people don't realize that when there are overlaps in between other countries, so either if you would like to move with the child from a country where they're established as belonging to, or when the parents are from different countries, you may face a similar legal dispute or disagreement in terms of where the child is supposed to live. So if you would take a child from one country where they belong to another country, and either the country, the state, or the other parent log a Hague Convention proceeding, you will have a court hearing that will establish where the child is supposed to live and whether it's in the child's best interests to maintain with the person who's left the country to another country. Most often, and I think the overlap for me that really goes back to the work that I've done, is that it tends to be migrant mothers. So what I see a lot and what I really have a deep understanding for, also as a migrant, I'm Swedish, but I've lived in a lot of countries, is this whole idea of coming as a mother to a country. And although you manage to maybe learn the language, speak the language, try to understand the costumes, there will always be elements where you will be othered as adverse side, and we have all these frameworks talk about. So, of course, a lot of times, and especially in the context of family violence or domestic abuse and violence, what we see is a migrant mother who may have moved to a country, she meets someone, they have a child, she fears for the child's and her life, so she returns back to the country where she feels like that's her safety. But of course, if the child has lived in the original country, the father can then launch Hague proceedings. And she will be forced to go back to that country to litigate. What I think the system forgets then is that although you may have lived in the country, you will still have this distinction between the we and them, where the mother will be othered. And a lot of times we see the child being framed as belonging to the country where the litigation takes place and to the father. So there are all these small elements in terms of racial bias and being framed as not being a part of the community and the we that also represents the court system that the mother is up against, which sadly means that in a lot of these cases, the evidence raised in the context of domestic violence and abuse, particularly when it's primarily the mother who's experienced violence and it's not been directed, or there is no physical evidence, just like in the family courts. There's a great focus on, bruises, any marks that we can see, photograph, very poor understanding of coercive control or any forms of violence that may not take that shape or have smaller or certain elements of physical violence. So a lot of times we see that the child ends up staying with the mother. In some situations, the mother may not be able to get a visa. The visa could be tied to the perpetrator father, so she can't stay in the country and see the child. In some countries, removing a child is framed as abduction. So this is another thing that a lot of people don't maybe understand, that removing a child, although you are the parent and you have custody or parental responsibility, still count as abduction, so parental abduction in the eyes of the law. So in some countries, that is actually a criminal offense, and the mother can also face criminal proceedings. We also see mothers putting all their financial resources into hiring a barrister or a solicitor and try to protect the safety of themselves and their child, and then not being able to pay child maintenance if the custody and residence now has been placed with the father, and then ending up with criminal proceedings associated to child maintenance, missed child maintenance. So it really creates a really complex system. And for me, as a woman who have lived in a lot of countries, and I really appreciate, you know, the freedom and, you know, the empowerment that I feel that we have built around having independent women who shouldn't be tied to a patriarchal system. I find it very, very difficult to accept that we have this entire legal system that keeps of course, it's the child that can't move legally. The mother can move legally. But then again, what mother would leave their child behind and relocate by themselves?
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you my protective parenting program. I hear from parents all the time that it's a game changer for them. It's really about creating opportunities for you to be almost like a therapist in the home for your child who is suffering coercive control. Lots of you know I wrote the book, Every Moment of Every Day. It's a children's book to help children and protective parents as they navigate these situations where they're feeling overwhelmed and dysregulated. Beyond that, we need to be helping our children to understand what their body is telling them, and also really looking through a coercive control lens at their experiences. It's time that we really understand that children are experiencing the same exact trauma that we experienced. How do we parent them differently? Our children are different as a result of this experience they've had, and we are different. And we have to truly look through the coercive control lens to support them. I hope you will join me in the Protective Parenting Program. It's offered live and self-study. And of course, I always hope that if there's anything I can do or any of my team members can do to support you, that you reach out.
Right. And then to add to your point, this idea that, well, first of all, it feels to me like it's systemic coercive control, right? And if you're feeling unsafe in your family relationship, your family dynamic, where do you want to go? You want to go hopefully back to a community that you feel supported in. And when you go, then you are characterized as kidnapping, right? Or, and certainly then the response to that, oftentimes what I've seen, at least in the Hague cases I'm familiar with, is then the mother is accused of, in this case, mother's alienation, right? Where she is now trying to protect her child and herself from something that may not have been physically violent, but that doesn't mean it's not coercive control, right? Like, I think that's the other piece, is that people think of coercive control only as hidden abuse. And the reality is the trajectory for harm starts off in a psychological nature, but often progresses into the legal sphere. And then these children and these mothers are less safe when they, there's a safety measure there, right? It's like this conversation I often have with protective moms. I do a little custody and divorce coaching, and this idea that, sometimes staying feels safer, right? And in these situations, I'm sure that a lot of moms, and I'm familiar with some, figure out that, oh my gosh, I thought I'd be safer leaving, and I'm not. And in the meantime, what we know about these character traits of abusers is that they really may not have been very engaged in the child's care or well-being. And now all of a sudden, they're going to rise up and display themselves, perform in a way that makes the court think that they are, as I think, Elizabeth Dargano talks about this, the good enough father, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, or even at all, because what we see, if we're going to be talking about England and Wales, for example, we have a system of parental responsibility where the status quo is that both parents, if they're married, or if the father now signs the birth certificate, will have parental responsibility. And parental responsibility means the decision-making power, as in custody. So that alone would actually allow him to put in the court application and say, oh, I'm aware now that my child has moved. I have never seen this child, but actually, I don't think, and I haven't given the permission. A side note related to parental alienation is that I've worked primarily in England and Wales, and I say England and Wales because of the court system and the differences. But I'm also doing expert testimonies in family courts in Sweden, and then I worked in Brazil primarily if we're talking about the family court system. And a side note is that when I started this work, it was very separate. So parental alienation allegations and court cases where we saw alienation allegations tended to be within family court nationally. But slowly we have kind of seen how it's also moved into the Hague proceedings. And one thing that I'm seeing more and more is that, of course, if you are this migrant mother who wants to return home, you have managed to escape maybe years of domestic abuse. You have no resources. You may not be able to get a job. You may not legally be able to get a job if your visa is tied to your abuser. The only avenues you have to leave would be to go to your perpetrator and ask for permission to live with your child or relocate with your child, who is the person who is putting you at risk. Or you would be able to go to court and ask for permission. So the court would be the only other system that can agree to a relocation. So you ask for a relocation order. And what I've seen now is that as soon as a mother is doing that, the father will use the actual, the question about, I would like to relocate, as evidence of alienation. So the fact that you are trying to put distance between me and my child in itself is alienation. And as we know, this is pseudoscience. It has no scientific background. We've written a very good brief article, which I can share after, that explains why and why it scientifically can't really be used as an argument. But of course, in court, the father will frame this as abuse. So then we see a lot of mothers taking back these relocation applications. And if we're now talking about entrapment, they are physically, legally, financially, and in so many ways, psychologically, emotionally entrapped in a country where they don't want to be. And of course, that would in no way be in the best interest of the child to have a mother who is stuck in a country.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic to see how persuasive in particular the abusive person can be, right? And also to see how the family court system very quickly aligns with abusive parents, even as you mentioned earlier, even if there's a history of actual physical bruising, like violence, we know it's all violent, right? But in general, even if there's evidence of that, and then it ends up happening, and I've seen this happen, and I'm sure you have too, where the children end up being placed with the abusive parent, like overseas now, and now the mother actually can't get back to the country of where her child is, right? And so again, a further entrapment. And I think what we're really talking about, right, is again the systemic coercive control. The system doesn't truly understand, or I don't know, what has been your experience? Because that's another conversation, isn't it? Like, does the system understand, or is it?
I've spent so much time reflecting on this, and I think I started thinking it must just be that people don't understand. They don't understand the dynamics. They don't understand the impact of being on the receiving end of violence. They don't understand what it means to a child also to be under this targeted attacks of coercive and controlling behavior on a daily basis. But I think I've kind of gone from there into it is all a patriarchal system. And it's all about power and control. And all our societies, or most of them, there are a few differences, but most of them build on patriarchal systems. So I think it just extends, and we see it being reproduced within our legal system, within how we think. It doesn't matter, if the judge is a woman or a man. Sometimes it doesn't matter if, they have a migrant background, or if it's someone identifying as BAME. So I think, of course, I'm a professor in intersectionality, and there are other very interesting elements where you see this being reproduced. So something else I've seen a little bit in terms of trends is that the courts seem to be more willing to accept that a father is a perpetrator when, if we're talking about the UK now, it's not a UK citizen. So when it is a migrant father, I see more. So I studied this in the context of parental responsibility in an article that's coming out very soon. And we saw actually that there seemed to be a trend. And of course, you need to study more. You need larger scale data to really establish it. But I did say that when parental responsibility was removed in the context of domestic abuse and violence, a lot of times the father had another heritage, or it was written into the court order. So then we also have the racial dynamics, where we come back to what I said in terms of we and them. It's this re-establishing of, we are the community, and this is our child, and the father, a lot of times, if we're talking about hate proceedings, it belongs to us, and his child belongs to us, and then the mother is othered. So anything which is reproduced as negative will be placed on her, where all the positive. So I think that also serves to explain, like what you're saying, but it was probably just one time that he was physical, or he lost his temper, or he had a very difficult, maybe he lost his job, and there are all these excuses and understanding, or how many years have passed. Well, that's historical. I don't think that's a repetition. Or if we're talking about child sexual abuse, those are some of the cases that I feel are the most harrowing, because we are working on some cases now in Sweden where the children are repeatedly coming with physical, medical evidence, and yet it's the father's word that overrules any of the medical evidence in the court system.
Right. So it does go back to this idea that women in general it's the pathologizing of a woman, right? And that her word doesn't have any credence in the family court system. When we talk about justice and you come forward and say that your child's been sexually abused, or your child's disclosing. I have so many mothers that I work with where this has happened. And it's really quite remarkable that sometimes the only answer is to say to the court, you're right, that happened 6 months ago or a year ago, and maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I've, and that in and of itself, that's, again, to your point, it's very harrowing to have to live through that and not be able to protect your child, or to try to protect your child and have your child taken away from you. I see this, actually, what I'm seeing is a very significant uptick of this. Now, I know it's always been there, but I think people are coming forward now. My work began in child sexual abuse, and there is over and over again these children. I wonder what your thoughts are on this. Like, I feel like the system is set up in a really ideal way that if I'm a perpetrator, I have access.
Yeah, I think it goes back to Professor Joan Mayer's work and what she found in the US, that if we're talking about parental alienation allegations, if it was in the context of child sexual abuse, more mothers did lose custody and would see the children placed with abusers. So I think that there is really, I mean, what choice would you have as a mother if your child either discloses child sexual abuse or you see medical evidence of this? You should protect them. And if you don't protect them and try to seek support from the system, you will be punished for that instead, where, it's a failure to protect. And why didn't you try to seek support and help? So it's really the mothers being trapped in between, a rock and a hard place, that either you try to seek the support of the system, and a lot of times we see the children being then placed with the abuser, or you don't disclose, and then if it in any way comes up later, there's a failure to protect. I've also spent a lot of time reflecting around this, and I think it goes back to the argument, but also I think as human beings, we have a very, very, very hard time accepting that especially sexual abuse and child sexual abuse occurs in a family dynamic or is perpetrated by people that we know. So I think we're still really reproducing these ideas about stranger danger and that it's someone that is external. So I also work on child sexual exploitation and trafficking when it is in a separate context. And I do say that these children, they do get more support, while within family dynamics, there's a lot of punishment, both of the mother, but I would also say the children. So that really goes back to my article that I published in terms of, so I was really trying to explain reunification therapy. And I found a very interesting case that described something which would be the closest to the reunification camps that we've seen in the US and Canada, but then in the UK or within the family court system of England and Wales. So it was a situation where a social worker then moved in with the father as the children had been removed from the mother, and the treatment plan, so-called treatment plan, was supposed to occur within that setting, which in itself, I'm assuming for you as a professional in that context, it's remarkable that it's even...
Part of what I'm doing is trying to train attorneys, coaches, and of course therapists, because it's quite, I'll use the word remarkable again, how many therapists that I've worked with or met along the way or hear of that there's significant ethical violations occurring. And if you think about the do no harm, reunification or forced repair therapy, regardless, I always say, even if a child is aligned with the abuser, to force that child to be pulled away from that abusive parent, if that's who they believe is their primary attachment, it comes from an attachment lens, that's harmful. It's a very delicate situation. And so I have protective mothers say, I want my child to go to repair therapy with me. And I often say, but you understand, every time that child gets in the car to go to that therapy session, and they're going back home to the abuser's house and they're leaving the abuser's house, that there's going to be a tightening of the coercion, right? That abuser is going to really impact that child psychologically, like a cult indoctrination, so that child feels they have no choice, that they are trapped themselves. And so alleviating the pressure, like I call it a gas pedal, like alleviating the pressure a little bit will help your child hopefully gain clarity over time. But putting the pressure on, unfortunately, is going to make them they have no choice, align more with the abusive parent. It's a really hard place to be, though, as a protective parent, to live in that space where you know that your child is being harmed, that they have the wrong information, they're not being told the truth. And then you have to kind of, in some ways, just wait. And waiting is extremely painful. That's what I see a lot with people. And back to your point about Joan Mayer's study, is for those of you listening who aren't aware, she found that when mothers disclosed sexual abuse, they were disbelieved at a rate of 15% in the family court. So we know that the system doesn't really believe the problem of, in general, abuse, but certainly sexual abuse of children, because the rates are extremely high, as you know. 93% of offenders, probably more than that, are known to their victims, right? It's someone the child knows. And we know that, of course, biological and step-parent fathers are many times these perpetrators. And so having conversations around safety, like, where your bathing suit is private, no one should touch you there, those are great. But if it's your father or someone else in your family system doing that, that's a really challenging space to be. And then if you disclose, are you protected? And I think that's always, maybe you could, discuss this a little bit, but the idea that I am trying so hard to protect my child and I can't.
Hi, everyone. Are you seeking enhanced knowledge and a certification supporting victims, survivors of coercive control? Do you acknowledge that all too often the systems are failing to do this, and most importantly, failing to prioritize the physical and psychological safety of children? Maybe you are a court professional, an attorney, a guardian ad litem, a custody evaluator, an advocate. Whatever work you are doing, if you are a therapist, we need a sea of allies. Right now, this training offers 12 CEs for anybody who completes it, and also it has reciprocity to other mental health professional certifications. I do hope you'll join me. I offer it live periodically throughout the year, at least several times, and also offer it self-study. Again, I hope to see you there. We need a sea of allies.
I think, yeah, there are two really great points based on what you said now. And I think one is that when we are criticizing the whole idea or belief system surrounding parental alienation, we get these desperate mothers who get very upset, and understandably so, saying, but the perpetrator father of my child did manage to alienate my child from me. And there is this, and of course also the pro-parental or PA lobby groups, they use this to say that, you know, we academics who are critical of the belief system and its lack of scientific basis, that we are parental alienation deniers and we don't believe in child abuse, and there's all this criticism. So I think it is really important to acknowledge that it is possible, and especially in the context of continuous coercive and controlling behavior, where the child will be in such a state that, okay, my primary thing that I need here is to survive. And how do I survive and find safety within this targeted attack, which could be to align with the perpetrator? We know that that's possible. So of course, the only thing we're saying is that we need to use the right terms and words to describe that experience. And what I'm seeing and what I'm often telling protective mothers when they come to me and say, but I have been alienated and I am going to raise this in court, that is my experience, that I'm an alienated parent. I say that if I look at all the cases I've analyzed and all the mothers I've spoken to or interviewed, what I see is that parental alienation works very well for perpetrator father. It never works for mothers. Rarely. Maybe there is a single or a few cases, but most often the court system will say, or the judge will say, no, but that's not really alienation, or the impact is not too great. So parental alienation findings are very rarely established. And I think what is important, though, to remember, like you say, it's very similar to what I say when I have mothers coming in despair who have seen their children removed. And some of them, they don't have contact, or the only contact that they have may be a phone call or a video call once a month, where the perpetrator father is the one supervising the call. So the entire conversation would be controlled by the perpetrator. I also tend to say that you need to trust that they will come back to you. They will find the space, you don't know when, but there will be a moment where they manage to do the work, find a safe place and come back to you. But I think it's another thing that I feel is very, I don't know if it's poorly understood, but it's this, we have a great empathy for not removing, you know, offspring or animals from, you know, you would never take a kitten from a cat. If you see a child taking a kitten from a cat, you will immediately go, oh, no, the baby cat needs to be with his mummy. The mummy wants to look after the baby cat. We don't take them. But there's some loss of humanity in this context where you remove children without sometimes a single reflection in terms of the impact that will have, and not an impact or a distress for a day or two, but something that will continue throughout life, also after the relationship is re-established from that forced separation. That I think, it's really important to acknowledge that that's something structural that we have seen, for example, with indigenous populations or with Black mothers and Black families in the US. I would say that the removal of children in itself has become a legal weapon of power and control.
Oh my gosh, that resonates so much with me. I mean, this is the issue as a clinician, right? A therapist, understanding that the secure attachment is vital to a child's healthy development. And when you're living in a home with a mother who's being abused and a father who's an abuser, you know that the attachment there is this insecure attachment to, or anxious attachment to, this abusive parent. And then oftentimes, to your point, what the abusive parent does is makes the child feel or believe that the safe parent isn't safe, right? And so that indoctrination that occurs and that creates, unfortunately, I call it an untethering for the child. Now the child has no secure place to land, and they're developing with their brain growing all of the time. And the abuser, by doing this, what people don't realize is that it is really harming the developing brain's ability to stay in a regulated state, because you're so dysregulated over time. And unfortunately, the court systems don't understand how imperative it is for a child to have a secure, safe attachment. And by removing, I mean, to your point, I have so many mothers with younger children where they might be breastfeeding, or they might have like a 2-year-old who now for 2 weeks at a time is going to this other person's home. And that is not to say that fathers shouldn't be engaged in their children's lives if it's healthy. I use this example often. What I say is, I live near New York City. If I worked in New York City 80% of the time, and I was in a healthy relationship dynamic, but my partner and I decided to separate, and he was in charge of the children 80% of the time, and we divorce, he should still have 80% of the time. Like, people don't understand that relationship dynamic that was created from the very beginning and over long term is a very powerful one that helps with healthy child development. And people seem to think, oh no, now it's 50-50. Or when actually that's not the imperative. The imperative is who has had the primary, we call it the tender years, right? During those tender years. So I appreciate you saying that. That's so vital, I think. And I think that that's so lost on the family court system, and it's being used, to your point, as a way to further inflict harm. And it's inflicting harm on the children. Yeah.
Yeah. I think also the whole idea in terms of we try to teach our children that if someone says no, or they don't want to, or I don't want to play with that child today, we have to respect, their wishes and desires. But we don't show them the same respect in the context of, if we're now talking about absent parents. And I'm also all for all parents that are safe and bring any positive element to the child's life should clearly have a part. And even more so if the child wants to have a relationship, and also listening to how the child wants to have a relationship. I think that's also unique. Maybe the child prefers to have phone calls or video calls, or maybe they prefer to do letters. And then I also think that we really need to respect that. Otherwise, we can't really expect that they grow up into adults that respect the boundaries of other people if we're not showing them the same. So that is also a little bit what my article was about, where I try to use this framework in terms of children. On one hand, we are kind of stepping into saying that we're modern and, children, they have their own rights, their frameworks that are protecting the rights. But then when they do actually try to use those rights or raise their voices in terms of what's important to them and how they want to live and how they want to relate to family members or social beings, we find other avenues to make sure that we still control how and have good excuses through the court system, for example. One thing I hear a lot of times in this context, when a child is very clear in terms of how they want to spend time or not spend time with the parent, is, well, what would we do if the child said the same about not brushing their teeth or not going to school? So, we can't just, do what the child says. But they're very different. And there's also a gigantic difference, I think, to have a conversation with the child and explain the benefits of maybe spending time with someone and doing what we're doing, where we actually have court staff or social workers or independent social workers or experts, or in some countries, it's actually the police. So in Sweden, you would have the police coming and removing a child if it's in the context of child removal. Or you have, the financial system where you have gigantic penalties if you miss contact orders because the child doesn't want to. So I think, again, then we go back to, well, that in itself is coercive. And we come back to violence. So there are all these structural elements that I think one day it'll be the children who have experienced it, who will look back at what's happening. And I'm sure we will look at this as one of the most gigantic scandals of our times.
Yeah, and they are coming out, which is just wonderful. We do have young adults speaking out now, which is amazing. We're just about out of time, but one of the things I wanted to also, like when we talk about children having voices, one of my experiences has been that sometimes their voice is mimicking the abuser too, as I'm sure, right? And so for me, it's almost like understanding the parental subsystem, I call it, right? Like what's been going on between the two parents historically. If we could look back historically and we can see that one person has been exerting power and control over the other historically, whether it's been very insidious, like not as evident, but certainly we've seen that occurring. And then the child aligns with the more powerful parent. We can also start to unpack why are they aligning, right? And having those conversations. But that is really getting to, for I think a lot of court systems, into the minutia. Right. And it becomes problematic. But I do have lots of moms who their children, I have a mom right now where her child is willing to testify against her simply. So that's the child's voice, right? But the problem is that the child's willing to do what they need to do to survive because they have to go home to the abuser's house. And so that's a whole nother dynamic that is so problematic and sad when that occurs, right? These mothers are devastated not only to lose their children, but to have their children say horrible things about them. And to your point, that's when that quote unquote alienation is occurring on the other side. So we do have to work on educating the court system. And obviously your work is doing that. And so many other people are doing such profound research and sharing this information with the courts. We need I think what you said earlier is I used to think maybe they don't get it. And now I'm like you, I'm like, I think it's the patriarchy. I think the systems are in place that make it either irrelevant. There's a disregard for humanity, to your point about the kitten. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we are, if we're going to end on a positive note, I
Yes.
do think that we are small steps in the right direction. I mean, your work and even understanding coercive control really feeds into what you're saying now, because that really sets out a framework to understand that child, which is repeating the words of the abuser. And for example, in Sweden, we don't have a clear coercive control law. And that also comes with not understanding the actual deadly risks that comes with coercive control, where I can see that slowly, not only NGOs and advocacy organizations, but I also see conversations that are tied to the United Nations or the European Union that are moving in that direction of really understanding the risks, and that coercive control is really the essence of all violence.
Absolutely. I have one of the students that works with me. She's an MSW student, and where she's going to school, she said the law students are actually talking about coercive control. So we are, I think, gaining some momentum and creating some knowledge that everybody needs to have. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
So much. Thank you so
thank
much
you so much for having me. It's been lovely.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you in person. So
exactly. Yeah, all the same. We'll do it again soon again.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Perfect Prey, a Course of Control podcast. You can find the show on my website at iknowyourheart.com or courseofcontrolconsulting.com, or subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts. I'd love your feedback, and I'm always looking for ideas on how to continue to expose coercive control as the significant harm in child abuse that it is. The best way to support the show is to rate and review Perfect Prey on Apple Podcasts. It helps others to find us. Perfect Prey is written by me, Dr. Christine Cocchiola, and with the help of my amazing team. Thank you, and have a great day, everyone.